Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that is absolutely central to how we build knowledge, especially in the behavioral sciences, research ethics.
That's right. When you think about research, you probably picture experiments, maybe surveys, collecting data.
Yeah.
But beneath all of that is, well, a critical framework of responsibility. It's about ensuring the welfare and dignity of everyone involved, humans and, yes, even non-humans, and upholding honesty in the pursuit of knowledge itself.
We're pulling from a specific source today, a dedicated chapter on ethics from a research methods textbook. And this isn't just a dry list of rules,
No, not at all.
It's a story, really, shaped by history, including some examples of what happens when ethics are pushed aside. Some are genuinely surprising and frankly disturbing.
Our source mentions a classic example, the study where participants were tricked into believing they caused a computer crash.
Oh, right.
And then confessed to hitting a key they didn't actually touch.
Yeah, the Casson and Keishel false confession study.
Yeah.
It immediately makes you pause and think, like, was that okay?
Yeah,
How does research like that even happen within an ethical framework?
exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack the core ethical principles, the practical guidelines researchers follow, the committees that oversee everything, and the vital issues of integrity when reporting results.
Okay.
By the end, you should have a solid grasp of the ethical landscape that guides responsible research today.
Okay, let's dig in. When we talk about ethics in research, what are the sort of fundamental responsibilities researchers have?
Well, at the most basic level, there are really two. First, there's a responsibility to the individuals who participate, whether they're human or non-human.
Okay.
This means ensuring their welfare is protected and their dignity is respected throughout the whole process.
And the second responsibility?
That's to the discipline of science itself. It's about being accurate and honest in reporting research findings, basically maintaining the integrity of the entire scientific endeavor.
Our source makes an interesting point here, that ethics isn't just about a researcher's personal moral compass, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about proper conduct based on a consensus, an agreement within the scientific community.
So it's a set of agreed-upon standards.
Yes. And crucially, it's not something you only think about at the end of a project. Ethical considerations are woven into every single step of the research process.
Every step, like from the moment you conceive an idea.
Absolutely. From deciding which research question is even appropriate to ask, how you select participants, what measurement techniques you use, how you carry out the study, analyze the data, all the way through to how you present your results. Ethics really bounds the scientific exploration.
So it's like a set of necessary boundaries.
Yeah.
You might have a fascinating research question, but if answering it requires unethical practices, it's just off limits.
Precisely. As the source notes, for obvious ethical reasons, the no harm principle, you can't just plan a study where you intentionally injure someone's brain to see what happens.
Right, of course not.
But you could ethically compare, say, cognitive abilities in existing groups, like athletes from contact versus non-contact sports, because the potential harm wasn't caused by your research.
Okay, that makes sense.
Similarly, for privacy, you can't just set up hidden cameras in someone's bedroom. That's obviously wrong.
Yeah,
But you can ask them to fill out a questionnaire about their private behavior with their consent.
that makes complete sense. It's about finding ethical ways to explore these questions. So where did these formalized standards and boundaries come from? Were they always in place?
Oh, not at all. Formalized guidelines are relatively recent, largely prompted by some really horrific historical events. The major catalyst was the discovery of those unspeakable medical experiments conducted by the Nazis on prisoners during World War II.
Those were truly barbaric.
They were unwilling participants subjected to torture, really, under the guise of research. The trials that followed at Nuremberg in 1947 led directly to the Nuremberg Code,
Right.
which is a foundational set of 10 principles for ethical human research.
So that was the start. But did that solve everything immediately?
Sadly, no. Even with the Nuremberg Code, history shows us the need for stricter, enforced regulations. Our source mentions other examples, like injecting unsuspecting patients with live cancer cells in 1963.
Wow. Just wow.
And maybe the most infamous U.S. example, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. That was exposed in 1972.
Ah, yes.
For 40 years, nearly 400 African-American men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated, even after penicillin became widely available and known to be effective.
Just so they could watch the disease progress.
Exactly. Researchers just wanted to observe its natural course. The harm and the deception involved were just profound.
That's just staggering in its cruelty and deceit.
It is. And it wasn't just medical research either. Behavioral science had its own catalysts. Milgram's obedience study from 1963.
Where people thought they were shocking someone.
Right. Participants believed they were administering really painful electric shocks to another person.
Even though no real shocks were delivered, the participants experienced significant distress, didn't they?
They really did. Our source points out the psychological harm participants felt: shame, embarrassment, just distress at their own capacity for inhumane behavior under authority. This study was a major factor in sparking discussions within the American Psychological Association, pushing them towards developing a formal code of ethics.
So these failures, these terrible examples, directly led to the regulations we have today.
Absolutely. The U.S. Surgeon General started requiring formal review for federally funded research in the late 1960s, and this all culminated in 1974 when Congress passed the National Research Act, which mandated protection for human subjects and established the National Commission.
The commission that produced the Belmont Report.
Exactly that one. In 1979, that commission published the Belmont Report, which laid out the 3 fundamental ethical principles that really form the basis for most current regulations regarding human participants in the U.S.
Okay, the Belmont Report. Let's break down those 3 core principles. What's the first one?
First is the principle of respect for persons, which also kind of encompasses the idea of autonomy.
Autonomy.
Yeah. This means individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, people capable of making their own informed decisions. They have to voluntarily consent to participate after receiving comprehensive information about the study.
So knowing what you're getting into and freely agreeing, that's key.
Yes. And this principle also requires special protection for individuals who might have diminished autonomy. Think about children or people with cognitive impairments or prisoners.
Right.
Their ability to provide truly voluntary consent needs really careful consideration.
How do the historical examples like Milgram and Tuskegee violate this specific principle?
Well, in Milgram's study, participants were deceived about the true nature and the potential impact of the experiment, right? So that violated their right to truly informed consent. And in Tuskegee, the participants weren't informed about the availability of penicillin, denying them the autonomous choice to seek effective treatment for their illness.
That's a clear violation of their right to make decisions about their own health.
Okay.
What's the second principle?
That's beneficence. This requires researchers to strive to do no harm, first and foremost.
Do no harm.
Right. And also to minimize potential risk to participants and maximize the possible benefits. This applies both to the direct benefits for participants, if any, and the broader benefits to scientific knowledge and society.
So minimize risks, maximize benefits.
Makes sense. Precisely. Both Milgram's study, which caused that psychological distress we mentioned, and especially Tuskegee, causing severe physical harm and death by withholding treatment.
Yeah.
Those were just clear violations of beneficence. You might remember Bill Clinton's official apology in 1997 for the Tuskegee study that really underscores the magnitude of the harm inflicted.
That principle also brings up the complex idea of clinical equipoise that our source mentions, right?
It does. Clinical equipoise is basically the debate around the ethics of comparing different treatments in a study if a clinician genuinely believes one treatment is superior. The argument is that assigning someone to what you think is a potentially inferior treatment group could be seen as causing harm.
Because you're intentionally withholding what you believe is the best option.
Right. The principle of clinical equipoise suggests that these comparison studies are only ethically justifiable if there's genuine uncertainty and professional disagreement among experts about which treatment is actually superior. This raises significant ethical questions for studies using, say, no treatment or placebo control groups.
It certainly adds complexity to designing certain types of studies.
Okay.
The third principle from the Belmont Report.
That's the principle of justice. This requires that the procedures for selecting participants and treating them during the study are fair and non-exploitative.
Fair selection.
Yes, and the risks and the benefits of participating in research should be distributed equitably. Ideally, the participants should be representative of the population who could potentially benefit from the research findings.
So the burden shouldn't unfairly fall on one specific group, while maybe everyone else reaps the reward?
Exactly. Tuskegee is such a stark example of violating justice. The significant risks and harm were borne exclusively by this vulnerable population, poor African-American males, while the resulting knowledge about syphilis could, in theory, benefit the entire population. Their selection was clearly inequitable and exploitative.
Looking at these principles through the lens of those historical failures really makes them feel much more grounded and necessary, rather than just, abstract rules.
They absolutely are. They're direct responses to past harms, and they provide the moral foundation for the more specific, practical guidelines researchers follow today, like those from the American Psychological Association, the APA.
Okay, let's move on to those practical guidelines from the APA. How do they translate these big principles into day-to-day research practice?
Well, the APA Ethics Code provides a really comprehensive set of standards for psychologists. It gets updated periodically, to reflect evolving understanding and challenges.
Right.
And it's important to remember they are guidelines because, as we mentioned, no single document can anticipate every unique research situation that might come up.
But they cover the major ethical issues researchers need to navigate day to day.
Yes, and they align very closely with those Belmont principles. The first critical one is no harm. Researchers have a fundamental obligation to protect participants from physical or psychological harm and to take all possible steps to minimize any risks.
Physical harm is, thankfully, pretty rare in psychological research compared to medical studies, I imagine, but psychological harm seems like a significant concern.
It really is. Things like increased anxiety, stress, maybe anger, lower self-esteem, or embarrassment. These are real risks, especially in studies involving sensitive topics or deception. Researchers have to carefully evaluate and minimize these potential harms, and they need to clearly justify any unavoidable risk based on the potential scientific benefit of the study.
And the need to monitor participants during the study seems key here, too.
Oh, crucially important. If unexpected harm develops, the researcher has to be ready to stop the study immediately. The Haney, Banks, and Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment is a classic, albeit controversial example mentioned in the source.
Right, the prison study.
That simulation generated such intense psychological distress among some participants that it absolutely had to be terminated prematurely for their safety.
That study really highlights the need for continuous vigilance. The ideal, then, is for participants to leave feeling no worse than when they started.
Absolutely, that's the goal. Okay, next major guideline is informed consent. This is fundamental.
Okay.
It means providing participants with complete information about the research and their role before they agree to participate so they can make a rational decision.
So information, understanding, and voluntary agreement, those are the components.
Correct. But delivering on this perfectly can sometimes be tricky. For information, you sometimes can't reveal the study's full purpose beforehand.
Why not?
Well, maybe because of blinding, or if deception is involved, or if the outcomes are genuinely unknown in exploratory research. But you must inform them of all known potential risks and describe the procedures clearly.
What about understanding?
Yeah.
Just presenting information doesn't guarantee people actually get it.
Exactly. This is a particular challenge with certain populations, like young children, individuals with intellectual disabilities, or maybe some clinical populations.
Right.
In these cases, you often need consent from a parent or legal guardian, plus the participant's own assent, which is their affirmative agreement, to the extent they are able to understand.
So I guess that.
And researchers also have to use language that is clear, simple, and appropriate for the audience. No jargon.
And voluntary participation. This is where power dynamics could potentially create problems, right?
Right. Yes, definitely. Participants have to feel genuinely free to participate or decline without any negative consequences. Researchers need to be very mindful of power imbalances that could feel coercive.
Like between a professor and a student.
Exactly. Or a therapist and a client, or within institutional settings like prisons or hospitals. Participants must be explicitly told they can decline to participate or withdraw at any point without penalty, no pressure.
And this whole process is usually documented somehow.
Typically, yes, through a written informed consent form. Our source lists the common elements, explaining the purpose, procedures, potential risks and benefits, confidentiality, the voluntary nature, contact info for questions, and spaces for signatures.
Makes sense.
However, for minimal risk studies like anonymous surveys or just observing public behavior where individuals aren't identified, written consent or even dispensing with formal consent might be ethically permissible sometimes.
Okay. Speaking of not providing full information up front, let's talk about deception. When is it okay for researchers to actually mislead participants?
Deception involves purposefully withholding information or presenting false information to participants. Our source differentiates between passive deception, which is omission simply not telling participants something, like the true hypothesis of a memory study, for instance.
Versus active deception, which is commission actively lying or misleading them.
Yes, exactly. Like in the Ash conformity study where Confederates, people who seem like participants but are actually working for the researcher, give incorrect answers.
But the line judgment task.
Or that Casson and Keishel false confession study we mentioned where participants were led to believe they did something they actually didn't.
So the APA allows deception, but under really strict conditions.
Very strict. It must be justified by the study's significant scientific value, which has to outweigh the potential risk to participants. And, importantly, there must be no feasible alternative way to conduct the research without using deception.
So you can't use deception just because it's convenient or easier?
Absolutely not. And a crucial limitation is that researchers cannot deceive participants about research that is reasonably expected to cause physical pain or severe emotional distress. That's a hard line.
Okay, that makes sense. If deception is used, what happens immediately after the participant finishes?
That leads directly to debriefing. If deception was part of the study, participants must be debriefed as soon as their participation is complete. It's mandatory.
What are the main goals of debriefing?
There are several. The primary one, when deception is used, is to reveal the true purpose of the study and explain why the deception was necessary.
Okay.
It's also meant to minimize any negative effects the study might have had on the participant, maybe counteract any misconceptions. It can also provide educational value by explaining the researcher's contribution and, of course, answer any questions they might have.
So it's an attempt to sort of return participants to their pre-study state and also educate them a bit.
Precisely. However, our source does acknowledge that debriefing isn't always perfectly effective. Participants might remain suspicious, or maybe the debriefing itself could cause annoyance or even further embarrassment, depending on the situation. Factors like the nature of the deception, how sincerely the experimenter delivers the debriefing, and the timing can all influence how well it actually works.
And sometimes even warning participants beforehand that deception might occur, like in placebo-controlled drug trials, can ironically increase suspicion later on.
Right. It's a tricky balance. A potential long-term consequence is that if deception is used too often or improperly, it can make participants, and maybe the public, more skeptical of future research in general.
Yeah, I could see that.
It's a powerful tool that has to be used judiciously and always followed immediately by thorough, sensitive debriefing.
Okay. Finally, under these APA guidelines, we have confidentiality. Protecting participant data seems crucial.
Absolutely essential, both for ethical research and just for encouraging honest participation. People won't share sensitive info if they think it'll get out. Right.
Confidentiality means safeguarding the information obtained from participants and keeping it private, secret.
And this is distinct from anonymity, correct? They aren't quite the same thing.
Yes, that's a good distinction. Anonymity is a technique often used to ensure confidentiality. Anonymity means the researcher literally cannot link a participant's name or any identifying information back to their specific data, even if they wanted to. Link doesn't exist.
Okay. How do researchers achieve anonymity then?
Well, the simplest way is just to collect no identifying information at all on the data records. Anonymous surveys are a good example.
Sure.
If you do need to track participants across multiple sessions, say you might use a coding system, data is labeled with a code name or number, and there's a separate, securely locked list that links the codes to names.
Oh, okay.
And that list is destroyed as soon as it's no longer needed, usually as soon as data collection is complete.
So even with codes, the data itself remains separate and confidential. Exactly. And in research reports, results are almost always presented as group averages or statistics, which further protects individual privacy. You rarely see individual raw data presented publicly. This whole concept is very similar to IPA privacy regulations you see in healthcare.
Got it. So researchers follow these guidelines, but who enforces them? Who actually reviews these proposals before studies can even begin?
That's the crucial role of the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB.
The required oversight committee. I've heard of them.
Yes. Any institution conducting research with human participants, especially if it receives any federal funding, which most universities do, must have an IRB.
Okay.
It's a committee made up of both scientists and non-scientists, including community members, who review all research proposals involving humans.
All of them?
Yes. Their main purpose is to ensure the proposed research protects the welfare and rights of participants and complies with federal regulations, notably what's called the Common Rule, which is basically the federal law based on those Belmont principles we discussed.
And our source lists 7 key criteria the IRB uses to evaluate proposals. They really scrutinize everything, don't they? It sounds quite thorough.
They really do. The criteria cover the whole process. Let's see. 1. Minimization of risk. Is the researcher doing everything reasonable to reduce potential harm? 2. Reasonable risk in relation to benefits. Do the potential benefits either to participants or to knowledge justify the risks involved? Is the trade-off acceptable? 3. Equitable selection. Is the way participants are recruited fair? Is it avoiding exploitation of vulnerable groups? This goes back to the justice principle. 4. Informed consent. Does the proposal include proper procedures and clear forms to make sure participants are fully informed and consent voluntarily? The IRB actually reviews the consent form itself. 5. Documentation of informed consent. Is written consent necessary, or can it be waived for this specific study based on risk? 6. Data monitoring. Does the plan include ways to monitor for unexpected harm during the study and stop if needed? 7. Privacy and confidentiality. And finally, how will participant data be handled to ensure their privacy is protected? Looking at coding, storage, reporting.
Wow, that covers the full spectrum from start to finish. And they classify reviews based on the level of risk involved.
Yes, typically into 3 categories. There's exempt review for studies with essentially no risk, like completely anonymous educational tests or surveys.
Okay.
Then there's expedited review for studies considered minimal risk, meaning the risk isn't greater than what people encounter in daily life.
Okay.
A lot of basic classroom research falls here. And finally, there's full review for studies with greater than minimal risk, or studies involving vulnerable populations, deception, sensitive information, or some kind of intervention. A full review usually requires the researcher to actually attend an IRB meeting and discuss their proposal with the full committee.
It's definitely a rigorous process, designed specifically to protect participants before anything happens. Okay, what about research involving non-human subjects, animals? Are there similar structures?
Yes, research with animals also operates under a very strict ethical framework, which has also evolved over time. Animals are used in behavioral science for various reasons, sometimes to understand animal behavior itself, sometimes to generalize findings to humans where human research isn't possible, or for research that's simply not ethical to conduct with humans.
Are there key historical points here, too, similar to human research ethics?
Yeah, though maybe less widely known to the general public. Early animal welfare organizations like the SPCA date way back to 1866. More formal U.S. regulation came with the Animal Welfare Act of 1966, which has been amended several times since then. And there are also the U.S. government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals used in testing, research, and training.
And how is animal research regulated today? Who's doing the overseeing?
It's overseen at multiple levels. You have federal laws like the Animal Welfare Act, state regulations which can vary, professional organizations like the APA have their own guidelines, and critically, locally, by institutional animal care and use committees or IACUCs.
So an IACUC is basically the animal version of the IRB.
Exactly. The IACUC reviews and approves all research proposals involving vertebrate animals at an institution. Their job is to ensure humane care and ethical treatment.
Okay.
Their composition is also mandated by federal law. It must include a veterinarian with expertise in laboratory animal medicine, at least one practicing scientist experienced in animal research, and importantly, a member of the public who is unaffiliated with the institution, representing community interests and concerns.
That ensures an outside perspective is always included. What are the key APA ethical principles for animal care and use? What do they focus on?
They parallel the human guidelines and spirit things like qualified supervision, proper training for all staff handling animals, minimizing any discomfort, illness, or pain.
Right.
But they also extend to the general care and husbandry of the animals, covering housing, feeding, sanitation, ventilation, and regular veterinary care throughout the animal's life in the facility. Any procedure involving more than momentary pain or stress requires strong justification. Anesthesia is standard for surgery, and humane methods for euthanasia must be used if an animal's life needs to be terminated.
So pretty robust oversight for non-human subjects as well, really focused on humane treatment and scientific necessity.
Absolutely. The standards are high.
Now, shifting focus slightly, let's talk about ethical responsibilities after the data is collected and analyzed specifically in the reporting of research results. This seems to touch on scientific integrity itself.
Right. This gets into issues like fraud and plagiarism. The APA Ethics Code has very clear standards here, emphasizing accuracy in reporting and the need to correct any significant errors if they're discovered after publication.
Let's tackle fraud first.
Sure.
How is that defined in this scientific context? It sounds pretty serious.
It is serious. Fraud is an intentional, explicit effort to falsify or misrepresent data. This could mean fabricating data, just making it up, or altering existing data to make it fit your hypothesis or look more significant. It's a deliberate deception, and it's crucially distinct from an honest mistake or error in analysis or reporting, which can happen.
It feels like the cardinal sin of science, doesn't it? Given the whole point is supposed to be finding truth.
It absolutely is. Fraud undermines the entire foundation of science, which relies on trust and accurate reporting. Our source highlights the infamous case of Diederik Stapel,
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
a Dutch social psychologist who fabricated data in dozens and dozens of published papers over many years. It was a huge scandal.
That's just shocking. Why would someone, especially a prominent researcher, risk everything to do that?
Well, our source discusses some potential reasons, which are important to understand, even though they never justify the behavior. The intense competitive pressure in academia is often cited that constant need to publish or perish.
Right.
The drive to find statistically significant positive results to get published in top journals or secure grants. This pressure can be immense. A high personal need for success and admiration can also play a role for some individuals.
So the system itself can unfortunately create pressures, even if the choice to actually commit fraud is ultimately an individual ethical failure.
Exactly. Fortunately, there are safeguards against fraud built into the scientific process itself. The first and often most effective in the long run is replication.
Trying to repeat the study.
Yes. When other independent researchers try to repeat a study using the same methods and they cannot reproduce the original findings, it's a major red flag that something might be wrong, either an honest error in the original study or possibly fraud.
So replication is key to verifying results over time.
It is fundamental. A second important safeguard is peer review. When researchers submit their work for publication, other experts in the same field critically examine the methodology, the analysis, the results.
Before it even gets published.
Right. These reviewers can sometimes spot inconsistencies, statistical anomalies, or findings that just seem too good to be true, prompting further scrutiny. They're the first line of defense.
Okay.
And an increasingly important safeguard now is sharing research data. Many journals and funding agencies are now requiring researchers to make their raw data publicly available upon publication.
So anyone can check the analysis.
Exactly. So others can reanalyze it, verify the findings, or check for irregularities. Transparency is a powerful deterrent against fraud.
And if a researcher is caught committing fraud, what happens then?
The consequences are typically severe and career-ending. Loss of employment, retraction of all effective publications, sometimes revocation of academic degrees, cancellation of grants, being barred from future funding, and potentially even legal penalties, depending on the specifics. This Stable case resulted in his dismissal and the retraction of his doctorate.
A huge fall. Okay, what about the other issue in reporting? Plagiarism.
Plagiarism is essentially presenting someone else's ideas, words, or work as your own without giving them proper credit. It's another serious ethical violation and a form of academic dishonesty.
And this applies not just to copying text word for word, but also to paraphrasing or even just using someone else's core idea without a citation.
Absolutely. It includes using direct quotes without quotation marks or citation, summarizing someone else's ideas in your own words, that's paraphrasing, but failing to cite the original source, and even borrowing someone's unique theoretical framework or line of argument without acknowledging where it came from.
And the penalties are significant for plagiarism, too.
Yes, they can be. For students, it can mean failing the assignment, failing the course, suspension, or even expulsion from the university. For faculty and researchers, it can lead to job loss, a severely damaged reputation, retraction of publications, and other professional sanctions, similar in severity to fraud.
Our source mentions that sometimes plagiarism can be unintentional. How does that happen?
It can, unfortunately, especially if you're not meticulous in your note-taking while doing research. You might jot down an idea or phrase from a source, and later, when you're writing, you forget where it came from and incorporate it as if it were your own thought.
Oh, okay.
Or sometimes you might be so heavily influenced by the source material's wording or structure that your paraphrase stays too close to the original, even if you change some words. It can be hard to distinguish between your own original synthesis and ideas you absorbed from your reading if you're not very careful.
So vigilance and really careful citation practices are key to avoiding it.
Precisely. The source offers clear guidelines. Take thorough notes and always include full citation information right away. Identify the source of all non-original ideas or words in your drafts. Use quotation marks correctly for any direct quotes and cite them immediately.
Okay.
When you paraphrase, make sure you're restating the idea completely in your own words, and sentence structure, don't just swap out a few synonyms, always include a complete reference list at the end. And the best rule of thumb, when in doubt, cite the source. It's always better to oversight than to plagiarize, even unintentionally.
When in doubt, cite simple and effective advice.
Yes. And the source provides some useful examples contrasting unacceptable paraphrasing, which is still plagiarism because it's too close to the original or lacks citation, versus acceptable paraphrasing that correctly cites the source and uses a genuinely distinct structure and wording.
That's a helpful distinction to see laid out.
It really is. It emphasizes that ethical reporting is fundamentally about acknowledging the intellectual contributions of others, no matter how you incorporate their work into your own.
Okay, wow. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground in this deep dive. We've really journeyed from those historical events that basically scared us into creating rules.
Yeah, unfortunately necessary motivators.
All the way to the foundational principles like Belmont, the practical APA guidelines for human and animal research, the crucial oversight provided by IRBs and IACUCs, and the absolute importance of integrity, avoiding fraud and plagiarism when reporting findings.
It's really clear, I think, that ethics isn't some peripheral concern or just an administrative hurdle in research. It's deeply integrated into every single decision and practice.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally about protecting the individuals, human or animal, who contribute to our knowledge, and also about maintaining the trustworthiness and integrity of science itself.
And understanding these ethical considerations is absolutely essential, whether you're simply trying to critically evaluate research you encounter in your daily life, or certainly if you ever plan on conducting your own research in the future. These guidelines exist not to stifle scientific discovery, but really to ensure it progresses safely, respectfully, and honestly.
A truly critical point to end on.
So as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, maybe consider this provocative thought. Given the documented historical failures, and the very real pressures researchers can face in their careers, the publish or perish culture, we touched on how much trust should the public place in scientific findings. And what role does radical transparency, things like open data sharing, pre-registration, clear reporting play in building and maintaining that necessary trust between science and society?
It's a complex question for sure, and one that really highlights the ongoing importance of ethical practice, strong oversight, and yes, increasing transparency.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world of research ethics. We hope you feel much better informed on this absolutely critical topic.